Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. The subcommittee's meeting today to hear testimony on 5 bills that cover a range of issues: the collection, the use, and the preservation of geospatial data, geothermal energy development, and a mineral withdrawal in central New Mexico. Under Committee Rule 4F, any opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking member or their designees. I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent for Congressman Fulcher to sit on the dais and to participate in this morning's hearing. Hearing no objection, so ordered. To begin with, I want to welcome all the witnesses that are here and not in other committee hearings so far, which I appreciate. And I will say, as I welcome all, if committee members who are in other hearings come in, I'm going to try to honor them, and because they're trying to balance the craziness around here. So the folks that are there will go first, but we're going to have to figure out how we get the others in as they arrive. So I want to thank you all for being here, and those that are coming, I'm going to thank them too. I want to emphasize the bipartisan and practical nature of the legislation that we're considering today, and to thank my colleagues from across the aisle for working with us on this hearing and on these bills. We are truly kind of really looking at what we hope are really bipartisan approach. 3 of the bills today in the hearing, I think I mentioned that. No, I haven't. Address the collection, the preservation, and the use of geospatial data. Geospatial data is essential to a variety of industries, services, and activities that hold immense scientific, social, and economic value. Although most people are probably unfamiliar with the term geospatial data, federal, state, and local government management of that data is actually critically important to the lives of every American. Whether transporting goods more efficiently, mapping outbreaks of the flu, or getting driving directions on your smartphone, accurate and easily accessible geospatial data is fundamental in our modern world. Geospatial data also informs our land management decisions. It helps us determine the quantity and the quality of water. Same thing about minerals and energy resources, and it helps us conserve our natural and cultural heritage. The Federal Land Asset Inventory Reform Act, or the FLAIR Act, introduced by Mr. Kind and Mr. Westerman, directs the Department of the Interior to develop and maintain an up-to-date, centralized inventory of federal property to assist in better managing our public lands. In 2007, a National Academy of Science report detailed how the Department of Interior used over 100 different land management systems across multiple agencies. The FLAIR Act, which I just described, is one potential remedy for this problem. Geospatial data also helps government officials, emergency responders, and landowners assess how vulnerable an area is to deadly and destructive natural hazards. The prevention of these hazards is especially relevant in 2 of the bills on our agenda today. H.R. 496, Mr. Soto's Sinkhole Mapping Act, and H.R. 4299, Ms. Velazquez's Data Preservation Act. The Data Preservation Act, which authorizes the National Geological and Geophysical Data Preservation Program, is long overdue. The authorization for this valuable program expired in 2010. While the U.S. Geological Survey has kept its operational, state geological surveys rely on grants from this program to preserve and digitize our country's geological and geophysical data. This data is invaluable, representing literally millions of cores, maps, photographs, and more that have been collected over the last century and a half. These collections aren't simply museum pieces. They are used every day by the private sector, by teachers, and government officials. In 2017, the State Geological Survey in my home state of California used a grant from the National Geological and Geophysical Data Preservation Program to inventory and digitize decades-old aerial photographs. These photographs helped local governments in Riverside County determine which areas were prone to landslides after a wildfire, and goodness knows that is an all too frequent occurrence now, and effectively prevented local communities from being subjected to a second natural disaster. The importance of geospatial data cannot be understated. We have two other bills on our agenda today also that are worth really mentioning. H.R. 4026, Mr. Fulcher's Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Lands Act, addresses one of my favorite topics, expanding clean energy on public lands. Geothermal is a promising renewable resource, but development of this resource has stalled. We must be doing more to increase development and level the playing field for geothermal energy on public lands, and this bill offers some ideas. Last, but certainly not least, H.R. 2640, Ms. Haaland's Buffalo Tract Protection Act, addresses the concerns of communities and tribes impacted by gravel mining on public lands near Placitas, New Mexico. The Bureau of Land Management is proposed to allow additional gravel mining in this area, which could worsen air and water pollution, which is already harming local communities, and it could impact important cultural heritage and wildlife mitigation corridors in this area. The bill before us would withdraw a few small parcels of land from mineral development and would permanently protect the health of local tribes and communities, as well as the resources they depend upon. I look forward to the discussion of these bills, and I now recognize Ranking Member Gosar for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the subcommittee will hear testimony on 5 bills, which I am pleased to say are almost all bills my colleagues and I can agree on. First, the Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Lands Act, sponsored by Representative Fulcher, supports our continued pursuit of an all-of-the-above energy strategy. Geothermal energy is a stable, renewable energy resource that is currently bogged down by a years-long permitting process. Almost all viable geothermal resources exist on federally managed lands, making production heavily dependent on federal regulations. This bill incentivizes development by lifting some of the regulatory burdens at the geothermal test sites, allowing geothermal resources to be produced at existing oil and gas operations, and permitting non-competitive leasing on adjacent federal lands. This bill also directs the Secretary of Interior to designate priority areas for geothermal energy development, just as my bill, the Public Lands Renewable Energy Development Act, does for geothermal, wind, and solar energy. We are also considering H.R. 4299, sponsored by Representative Velazquez and co-sponsored by Representative Lamborn, which reauthorizes the National Geological and Geophysical Data Preservation Program. This program was established in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and provides support to state geological surveys and the Department of Interior to preserve geological and geophysical data. The program also maintains the National Digital Catalog, which provides public access to information such as data sets, photographs, and samples at the U.S. Geological Survey and the state geological agencies. Before this program, no national standard for the data collections existed. and there was limited coordination between parties. This resulted in disorganization and overfilled information catalogs. Reauthorizing the National Geological and Geophysical Data Preservation Program would ensure the continued maintenance of our country's valuable information collections. It will also make my dad very happy. We will also discuss the Federal Land Asset Inventory Reform Act, or FLAIR Act, sponsored by Representative Kind and co-sponsored by Representative Westerman, which requires DOI to develop and maintain a single inventory of federally owned lands. The federal government owns vast amount of property, including government buildings, but there's no existing method to maintain a streamlined catalog of assets. Multiple inventories of property exist, some with duplicated information. We cannot effectively address our nation's infrastructure and maintenance backlog problems without an accurate picture of what we own. To solve this, the FLAIR Act creates an updated, publicly available, and easily researchable database to inventory all real property assets. This multi-purpose inventory shall support land management activities including resource development, agricultural use, active forest management, and conservation. Next, we have H.R. 496, the Sinkhole Mapping Act of 2019, sponsored by Representative Soto. This legislation creates a program to study the short and long-term causes of sinkholes, such as droughts and storms. H.R. 496 also requires the USGS to develop maps of higher risk areas for sinkhole formation, revise them as needed every 5 years, and makes them publicly available. These efforts will help diminish the risk to health, safety, and property loss by providing as much information as possible about where sinkholes are likely to occur. Now, I mentioned earlier that these bills are almost all ones we can agree with. Unfortunately, I cannot include H.R. 2640. This legislation would permanently withdraw almost 4,200 acres of land from mineral development in New Mexico. I do not believe it is in the interest of this country to put valuable resources off limits in perpetuity, in this case, sand and gravel. Sand and gravel and other aggregates are critical to infrastructure and construction. In fact, in 2018, industrial materials had a total value of over $56 billion, a 7% increase from the previous year. The estimated 36 million cubic yards of sand and gravel in the proposed withdrawal is a significant loss, especially to the local community, which will likely have high demands for infrastructure as its growing population continues to expand. I would like to enter into the record a letter in opposition to H.R. 2640 in the record from the National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association. Specifically, they write, quote, allowing this ban to proceed would have a significant impact on the cost of public work projects due to the necessity for stone, sand, and gravel required to develop and repair infrastructure and buildings to be imported into the area. According to conservative estimates, aggregate prices for the Albuquerque metro market would increase 30 to 40%, and some projections estimate a 90% increase in the total cost, end of quote. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss those bills, and I'd like to thank the witness for being here today. I want to make sure that this is entered in the record.
So ordered.
And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Before I recognize our first panel, I'd like to note that several of the bills in today's hearing would affect programs administered by the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Geological Survey. We invited both BLM and USGS to submit written testimony, but we did not ask them to submit any witnesses, just written testimonies. I'm disappointed to report that the department's top congressional affairs staff didn't allow either agency to provide views because we only gave them 10 days notice, and they said that was not sufficient.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
That's not totally accurate. DOI did submit, for the record, on geothermal, a letter.
Well, that's wonderful. I did
so,
not see that.
Yeah.
I thank the ranking member. Now I'm going to introduce today's first witnesses. Ms. Haaland is the representative for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District and the original sponsor of H.R. 2640, the Buffalo Tract Protection Act. Next, Mr. Soto is the representative for Florida's 7th Congressional District. What? 9th? 9th Congressional District. and is the original sponsor of H.R. 496, the Sinkhole Mapping Act. Mr. Fulcher is the representative for Idaho's 1st Congressional District and is the original sponsor of H.R. 4026, the Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Land Act. And finally, Mr. Westerman, representative for Arkansas's 4th Congressional District and is the original co-sponsor of H.R. 2485, the Federal Land Asset Inventory Reform Act, or the FLAIR Act of 2019. Ms. Haaland, welcome to the committee, to the subcommittee, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member and members of the committee, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding this hearing and for allowing me to speak in support of my bill, the Buffalo Tract Protection Act. I introduced the bill, which draws its name from the shape of one of the parcels of land involved at the request of my constituents who do not want more sand and gravel mining in their community. H.R. 2640 would withdraw 4 small parcels of Bureau of Land Management land near Placitas, New Mexico, in my district from mineral development. These parcels serve as critical connections for wildlife moving between the Sandia Mountains and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. They also provide an invaluable recreation open space in this growing area and are home to cultural resources important to neighboring pueblos such as San Felipe Pueblo. Yet the draft resource management plan for the area, BLM, released in 2012, proposed to open them to additional mineral development, including gravel mining. During the public comment period on that draft, 50,000 comments were submitted in opposition to the area, in opposition to mining. BLM has still not released the final RMP, so the area continues to be governed by an outdated plan that allows mining. Meanwhile, the community continues to wait and wonders whether the new RMP will or won't allow mining. This area already has 6 gravel mines, with 4 of them being among New Mexico's 13 largest gravel mines. In past legal settlements, area mine operators promised not to apply for more permits on BLM land until the resource management plan can be amended to reflect changes in Placitas, and they promised to make payments to benefit the management of nearby Placitas open space. Those payments were discontinued, however, and now we see efforts to expand the BLM mining lease. Local residents and leaders, including tribal leaders, have deep concerns about the impacts of additional mining on public health, cultural heritage, and wildlife. The character of Placitas has changed dramatically since BLM first allowed mining. It is now home to some 6,000 residents and is a retirement community with seniors who moved to New Mexico for its beauty and clean air, making up a disproportionately large share of the population. Particulate matter released by sand and gravel mining poses a special risk to seniors who already have heart and lung disease in some cases, meaning that additional mining would have a devastating impact on public health in the area. Sandoval County, the town of Bernalillo, the Merced de Comunidad de San Antonio de las Huertas, the Pueblo of San Felipe, the Pueblo of Santa Ana, and Placitas residents are all opposed to additional mining in the areas covered by this bill. I would like to enter into the record several statements and resolutions supporting my legislation and opposing new sand and gravel mining in the Buffalo Tract area. And Mr. Chairman, I have those for the record.
So ordered.
Mr. Chairman, sand and gravel mining in the area has already degraded air and water quality, and area officials and residents agree that this is not the right place for yet another gravel mine because there are already 6. In fact, BLM itself acknowledges alternative locations for the mining industry in the general area that are not wildlife corridors and are a safe distance away from population centers. A legislative withdrawal of the lands covered by this bill is needed to permanently preserve the habitat and recreation resources for the community and protect public health. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and on behalf of the constituents of New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, I urge you to support H.R. 2640. And I yield.
Thank you, Representative Haaland. Next, Representative Soto, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, both of you for the opportunity to testify before the Natural Resources, Energy, and Mineral Resources Subcommittee on H.R. 496, the Sinkhole Mapping Act of 2019. Sinkholes, as we know, are caused by erosion, sometimes shifting of water underneath the ground, and they appear suddenly and are devastating in their consequences. The dangers of sinkholes are real, and they occur in every state and territory. The cost of sinkhole damage to property over the last 15 years on average is at least $300 million per year. While rare, sinkholes can be deadly. For example, around 11 p.m. on the evening of February 28th, 2013, Jeff Bush, a man from Central Florida, our area, was asleep in his bedroom when a large sinkhole opened up directly under his house, swallowing him and his entire bedroom. But this isn't just a Florida issue. Sinkhole formation frequently occurs in states such as Texas, Alabama, Missouri, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. For that reason, I filed H.R. 496 with the aim of improving our understanding of sinkholes. The United States Geological Survey currently studies sinkholes, and the Sinkhole Mapping Act of 2019 would build on existing research activities that are making advances in understanding the geologic and hydraulic controls in sinkhole-prone landscapes known as CARS. Over the August district work period, I had the opportunity to visit my local USGS. While they mentioned they are doing this work, they also agreed there is no one source from which you can derive this type of information. To better inform and support rapid response to sinkhole formation and effective mitigation measures, the bill would direct them to focus on the short-term and long-term mechanisms that trigger sinkholes, including the extreme storm events, prolonged droughts leading to shifts in water management practices, as well as ongoing aquifer depletion and other major changes in water use. The bill would also direct the Director of USGS to establish and maintain a public website that displays maps that depict zones that are at greater risk of sinkhole formation and other relevant information critical for use by community planners, emergency managers. These are used by states and local governments, as you all may know, quite often, as well as every kind of industry from insurance to mining to home building to other key industries. So I want to thank you in advance for your consideration of this important legislation, and I look forward to working with you as H.R. 496 moves through the committee process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member.
Thank you, Representative Soto. Now, Mr. Fulcher, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar. Things look just a little bit different from this angle. Prior to serving in Congress, I had the privilege of serving in the Idaho State Senate for a number of years. And the only reason I bring that up is because the building that I served in the Idaho State Capitol, is heated by geothermal energy. And it's not new. That system that heats that facility and the entire complex was put in place in 1892. Not 1992, but 1892. And we are blessed to have the largest geothermal system in the USA there. We've got more than 6 million square feet of residences, commercial buildings, and other properties that are heated or have electricity as a result of that geothermal facility. The user fees that are associated with that provide the maintenance and the upgrades, and frankly, it works great. And sometimes I think we have a tendency to overlook geothermal. All of the dialogue seems to be around different sources, but geothermal can be a fabulous source when and where it's available. It's base load. You can ramp it up, you can ramp it down. It's renewable. All the water is re-injected into the aquifer that is used for that. Very low carbon, and if it's done right, can be very cost-effective. So here's the situation. We've got good news, bad news, as is the case with most pieces of legislation. The good news is we've got a lot of it, and it's in a very broad geography across many states, but largely in the West. If there's bad news, it is location-specific, and most of it is on federal land, which makes it a little bit harder to develop. It's estimated that about 90% of the reserves are on federal land. And just as a note, in our state, that's about 2/3 of our land mass. So that brings me to the purpose of H.R. 4026. It's really geared to make the exploration process for geothermal just a little bit easier. So the Enhancing Geothermal Production Act, or on Federal Lands Act, really has two primary components. The first one is it would provide a categorical exclusion for geothermal exploration sites. So that basically means that the full NEPA would not be required for the exploration phase. And that can mean that the process goes from years to months for the exploration phase. The second primary thing that it does, that it would permit a non-competitive leasing on adjacent federal land for entities that have a project going. So if there is a existing leaseholder, they would have a first right of refusal on adjacent federal land if there was an opportunity to expand that project. So Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member, this I believe is a win-win piece of legislation. It does encourage good, clean energy with a wise development process, and it is supported by the Department of the Interior. I think Ranking Member Gosar pointed this out, but Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I would like to enter into the record a letter of support from the Department of the Interior for H.R. 4026.
So ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Appreciate the opportunity.
And thank you, Representative Fulcher. Mr. Westerman, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to get to present testimony on H.R. 2485, the Federal Land Asset Inventory Reform Act, or the FLAIR Act. I would first like to recognize and thank my colleague from Wisconsin, Mr. Kine, for introducing this sound bipartisan legislation. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to point out, if this bill were passed and signed into law, it would be the Kind-Westerman Act. So not a bad name to have in front of your name. Yeah, very kind. Yeah. And we all agree. I'd also like to recognize my former colleague, Senator Kramer, for continuing the fight for smart governmental reform over in the upper chamber. As we legislate in the age of Twitter and 24-hour news cycles, it seems like little attention is paid to rational, practical, or common sense ideas. In this era of polarization, it seems like folks prefer confrontation to legislation or shouting to fixing, but this bill represents something different. It represents a return to good governance, to common sense. The Interior Department alone uses 26 different financial management systems and more than 100 different property management systems nationwide. If you multiply this number by the number of agencies and departments spread across the federal government, we're looking at hundreds, if not thousands, of different management programs. Even worse, very few or maybe even none of these systems talk to one another. Employees must frequently duplicate data, inputting things like procurement data or financial information into multiple programs, each with their own codes and processes. The GAO estimates that the federal government wastes $2 billion a year on unneeded federal property. As we work on this committee to address issues like maintenance backlog and other things where we would like to have more funds to make our public lands better, and if there's $2 billion of wasted money just on data duplication, that seems like it would be a really worthwhile thing to tackle. And this statistic, it only covers federal buildings because GSA doesn't survey federal land. And get this, the most recent official Interior report on lands suitable for disposal was from 1997, 22 years ago. It's plain and simple. Because of the overwhelming number of systems, codes, and processes needed to keep track of what the federal government owns, we are losing things. Moreover, we are wasting taxpayer dollars, and the inefficiency has a real impact back in our districts. I'd like to share with you an example from my district. I have a constituent who decided to build a cabin on private land surrounded by the Ouachita National Forest. He wanted to get a power pole strung along the existing Forest Service road that provided access to his cabin. Everything was good to go. He worked with the Forest Service, and they signed off on the environmental analysis. The power company agreed to come drop the poles in, and then nothing. For 6 months, nothing. It turns out the Forest Service survey lacked an accurate wilderness boundary. That information was contained in a separate system. So no problem, just move the poles to the other side of the road. That seems like it would make sense. The Forest Service approved the project again. The power company was ready to go. And guess what? Nothing happened for 3 additional months. Turns out the new route skirted a historical burial ground, information which coincidentally was on a separate system. Mr. Chairman, I wish that this was a unique case, but my office receives enough casework in this nature to fill a full-time position. Everything from constantly changing ATV access to vacant lots, which take years to come off the federal books. I've often said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and this bill is the ounce of prevention that this problem needs. It takes thousands of different information systems and puts them into one coherent program. If implemented, it will allow federal employees from DOI to communicate with USDA about the state of BLM rangeland health surrounding some at-risk timberland. If implemented, GSA will be able to differentiate which National Park Service properties need addressing as deferred maintenance and which properties have exceeded their lifespan. The list goes on and on. Will this bill cost money up front? Yes, it will. But what the CBO score won't tell you is the money this measure will save. A streamlined system will empower our federal agencies to make better choices faster, easier, and cheaper for the American taxpayer. This, in turn, will lead to more economic growth as infrastructure wait times decrease and excess property is offloaded to small businesses. We need bills like the Federal Lands Asset Inventory Reform Bill that take common sense approaches to little problems and do it in a bipartisan way. American taxpayers are losing money as federal employees struggle to keep track of hundreds of complex, incompatible systems, and I say that's something we should all be able to fix. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. Now, that concludes the first panel. Now I'd like to invite the second panel to take their seats at the witness table. I'm going to do that later. All right. Welcome to the panel. First, we have Mr. Rich Ort, Maryland State Geologist and President of the Association of American State Geologists. Next, we have Ms. Allison Anderson Book, the Executive Director of the American Geosciences Institute. Next, we have Mr. John Palatiello, President of the John M. Palatiello and Associates. And finally, we have Mr. Paul Thompson, Vice President of Business Development for ORMAT. Let me remind the witnesses that they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin The lights on the witness table will turn green, but after 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I'll ask you to please complete your statement. I'm going to allow the entire panel to testify before questioning any of the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Mr. Ort to testify. Welcome, Mr. Ort.
Good morning. Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee. Good morning. I am Richard Ort. I am president of the American Association of American State Geologists and the State Geologist for Maryland. Our members are the chief executives of all the state geological surveys, and almost every state has a geological survey that serves in the executive branch agency or a state university. Like the U.S. Geological Survey, our activities are focused on geological and topographical surveying, reduction of risk from geological hazards, and the identification and assessment of energy, water, and mineral resources. We collaborate closely with USGS, and we mutually benefit each other. I share with you today the vital role that geologic and geophysical mapping and data play in this regard. From addressing public safety concerns generated by geohazards to open access and rediscovering of historical and potentially vulnerable geologic data resources through preservation. Geologic hazards surround us and are present in all locations around the country. We see sinkholes in the news in Florida, but they are present in many areas including Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. Landslides are present in Washington State, Vermont, Michigan, and Colorado. And we see earthquakes, hazards in Alaska, California, and even Virginia. Geohazards occur throughout our nation and occur in many different formats. Geological hazards are a very real threat to our society. They cost tens of billions of dollars of physical and economic loss every year in the United States. Valuable lives are lost in these tragic events. Maryland has a sinkhole right now that engulfed a house and made the house next door unlivable. Fortunately, the house on the other side, which was rehabilitated for Habitat for Humanity housing, with a quadriplegic son and a low-income family, was not interfered with. In this day and age, we should be able to do better. Fortunately, we can, and much can be done to lower the risk and reduce future damage. AASG strongly supports all geologic hazard programs intended to save lives and reduce economic losses. Community resilience, or the ability to withstand or mitigate geologic hazards, is dependent on knowing these vulnerabilities to hazards and planning for those hazards. AASG applauds Representative Soto for sponsoring H.R. 496, the Sinkhole Mapping Act of 2019. Geologic hazards like sinkholes occur throughout the nation, and the development of risk potential maps assists land planners, developers, water supply managers, infrastructure design, and many others to make informed decisions resulting in increased safety to the public. However, AASG does not believe the language in this bill, as it is written, encompasses the necessary level of effort to provide actionable science and protect communities. AASG believes a comprehensive geologic hazard bill that supports mapping, research, education, and land use planning is the most effective way to reduce the impacts of sinkholes and other geologic hazards. A federal program which relies upon the states to map geologic hazards to the scale that is useful for community planning and focusing on the relevant geologic hazard in that area would reduce risk and save lives. ASG strongly supports preservation of and access to geological and geophysical data, which is facilitated through the Data Preservation Act of 2019. This bill reauthorizes the National Geologic and Geophysical Data Preservation Program for 5 years until 2024. ASG also supports a funding level with additional funds outside of the current USGS budget from the current $1 million funding to $11 million. ASG understands that despite the continuous evolution of geologic, geophysical, engineering concepts, and analytical techniques, there is a constant need to revisit, re-examine, and reanalyze rock samples and geological data over time. These second looks at archived and heritage data lessen the need for costly resampling and can yield energy, water, and mineral discoveries worth billions of dollars and generate tens of thousands of jobs. The state of Michigan utilized this program to process a donation of 4,000 cores. Upon reinspection of these cores, the discovery of the cleanest deposit of potash, critical for agricultural use in the Midwest, was rediscovered with a value of $65 billion. The state of Kansas analyzed a drill core from 1960 to investigate and solve the source of natural gas explosions and fires in downtown Hutchinson, Kansas, saving lives. The state of Florida digitized over 7,000 geophysical logs, leading them to a far better understanding of their aquifers and natural contaminants such as arsenic, thus providing for better management and public safety in the state's drinking water system. Furthermore, as our nation develops, many of our collections are irreplaceable due to changing landscapes. In summary, ASG endorses a more multi-hazard bill which will meet all of the individual states' needs and which utilizes state geological surveys to identify the geohazards in their states with risk-based geologic maps at the scale and in the areas most appropriate within their state. ASG fully supports the Data Preservation Act of 2019. Furthermore, ASG strongly recommends that this program be appropriated and funded at $11 million using additional funds to the USGS. Thank you for this opportunity to address this committee. I hope you find this information helpful as you consider these important matters.
Thank you, Mr. Ort. The chair now recognizes Ms. Anderson Book to testify.
Good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gozer, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute our thoughts here today on the important work you're undertaking. AGI is a nonprofit federation of 52 member societies that represents more than 260,000 geoscientists. Founded in 1948, we provide scholarly information services. We serve as a voice of shared interests in our profession. We play a major role in strengthening geoscience education and strive to increase public awareness of the vital role that the geosciences play in society's use of resources, resilience to natural hazards, and the health of the environment. The Institute supports H.R. 496 and thanks Representative Soto for introducing the bill. We do, however, seek to expand the mapping program to include other hazards such as coastal erosion, drinking water recharge, landslides, saltwater intrusion of freshwater systems, and more. A more comprehensive approach to mapping all types of geologic hazards will assist in highlighting the most vulnerable areas in the U.S., as there are some geographic areas that are particularly at risk to a range of geologic hazards. This type of assessment work takes resources, including experienced experts and financial resources. H.R. 496 does not provide any additional authorizations for funding this initiative, and we feel that this will require rather substantial funding to the USGS to adequately assess sinkhole-prone areas beyond the work that they're already conducting related to the topic, and even more if they would like to expand the range of the full range of geologic hazards. We are incredibly supportive of the skilled assessment work that the USGS conducts, but note that there are other organizations with information and expertise that can assist in an assessment project like this. This includes state surveys, like the state of Maryland's, and other research organizations such as the National Cave and Karst Research Institute. I'm going to call it NCRI henceforth. I want to speak about a local partnership that exists between NCRI and the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources as an example. The state of New Mexico is home to many types of geologic hazards, including cave and karst hazards that are both natural and man-made. A significant number of sinkholes and subterranean cavities exist in southeastern New Mexico that originate with solution mining of salt beds in the area. On July 16, 2008, a brine well cavity in Eddy County, New Mexico abruptly collapsed. The resulting sinkhole engulfed the well that was being used to mine the salt. The two organizations worked to map the extent of the damage and assess potential risk to the area for ongoing mining activities. They identified more underground cavities nearby that extend into residential areas and under major roadways. In the time since, the organizations working with other state and city officials have worked to set up an early warning system in the town of Carlsbad that provides notification should the area above underground cavities start to experience surface collapse. There's a picture of that in the testimony that we supplied. This remains a major threat to human safety in areas around Carlsbad and through Eddy County today. We are fully supportive of the geologic and geophysical data preservation reauthorization, but we do request that further consideration be given by the Congress to more fully fund this important program. While the authorization has been historically around $30 million per year, the actual funding for this has been far smaller. This work has been funded through the USGS so that state geological surveys can conduct the data preservation activities, yet the scale of each project exceeds the annual funding that states receive. Our concern is that this places a funding strain on the USGS, and many of the projects then remain incomplete at the state and local level. We encourage the members of this committee to work with their appropriation colleagues to more fully fund this work. I wanted to quickly share a personal example of some work related to this, and Mr. Ort actually hit on it in his testimony. On the morning of January 17, 2001, a natural gas explosion occurred in the downtown area of Hutchinson, Kansas. Later that day, gas geysers erupted 2 miles to the east of the edge of the town. These events coincided with a major gas leak that occurred at the Yagi gas storage facility, located approximately 7 miles northwest of Hutchinson. That was actually my PhD research. The survey's work related to determining the origin and pathways of the natural gas as it migrated to the town of Hutchinson, Kansas. My role was to review historic geologic cores and analog wellbore data from very far back for the areas around Hutchinson. Had we not had that historical data, we wouldn't have been able to determine the historical pathways, or actually the modern pathways for the gas coming up. In that instance, people did die from the gas explosion. So while some of those historical records have been digitized, a large analog data set still requires conversion and storage in a digital archive. Lastly, geothermal energy is one of the only truly sustainable and renewable energy resources on the planet, though it is less recognized for renewable energy production, often is called the forgotten renewable, behind solar and wind power. There are many advantages to geothermal, including continuous baseload power, its low emissions profile, and limited impacts to the Earth's surface. There are a lot of very positive aspects of HR 4026, including language that would allow for the ability to co-produce geothermal energy from waste heat produced from existing oil and gas leases. AGI is very supportive of the development of geothermal energy resources. However, it's important that a robust environmental impact analysis be conducted prior to the development of any new energy project on federal lands, even in the test phase. Any deviation from established siting practices could erode the public trust in any geothermal project that is developed on federal lands. The programmatic environmental impact study proposed in the bill could provide a robust review of potential impacts of production in any given expansion area, as long as it's completed and reviewed prior to holding a lease sale or issuing a permit. Another aspect that isn't clear is the definition of a qualified geothermal professional as an individual who is an engineer or geoscientist in good professional standing. In many geoscience positions, licensing or professional certification is a requirement. Is it the intention to require that certification level? If not, what are the qualifications that meet good professional standing? To conclude, I want to thank you for the invitation to weigh in on these important topics in legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson-Book. The chair now recognizes Mr. Palatiello to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. After hearing all of the opening statements from the members of the subcommittee, I'm tempted to dispense with my prepared text and just take questions from the floor, because I think you've collectively made the case for the bills that I want to address. I would take one exception, Mr. Chairman, to something that you said. You commented that most people don't know what geospatial data is. I would argue that any American that has one of these uses geospatial data almost every day.
Absolutely uses it, but if you gave them a quiz and said, what is this, they wouldn't connect the two.
I
But
would
you're right.
agree. I
They
would
all use it.
Yes, sir, I would agree. Let me address, I was asked to address 3 bills, and it is my pleasure to do so. H.R. 496 would direct the Director of USGS to establish a program to map sinkholes. I would commend to the attention of the subcommittee the 3D elevation program that is already underway at USGS. I provided a slide with an image of that. I don't know if we can bring that up, but we would recommend the 3D data as the base data for the sinkhole mapping activity. The image that I had shows a LiDAR image which is draped over an aerial photograph, and it very vividly shows how you can map sinkholes, and this is from some of the activity that is already going on at USGS. I would point out again, as my colleague Ms. Brooke did, this is an example of an activity where the USGS has a program, it is struggling, and this subcommittee's work with the Appropriations Committee to fully fund 3DEP, we believe would be essential. H.R. 4299, the Data Preservation Act, would continue the National Geological and Geophysical Data Preservation Program. This bill is about good data, upon which intelligent policy debates can take place and informed decisions can be made. It also supports the concept of open source data, which is really the standard in the geospatial community and is becoming the trend around the globe. I'd like to spend the rest of my time discussing H.R. 2485, the Federal Land Asset Inventory Reform, or FLAIR Act. I've testified before subcommittees of the Natural Resources Committee on this issue on previous occasions, and I've cited Peter Drucker's admonition that you can't manage what you can't measure. Well, if we don't have a current, accurate inventory of the land that the federal government owns in stewardship for the American people, we're not doing a good job of managing that resource on behalf of the people. So this bill would provide for a current, accurate inventory of all land that is owned by the federal government. Managing federal real property has been a high-risk activity of the government as identified by GAO for more than a decade. GAO has highlighted the lack of a current accurate inventory of federal property as one of the contributing factors to being such a high-risk activity. The technology today, particularly geographic information systems, allows the stewardship of data based on one uniform interoperable platform. The FLAIR Act also authorizes the Secretary of the Interior to conduct an inventory of inventories. As Mr. Westerman pointed out, there is enormous duplication and proliferation of stovepipe single-purpose inventories. We believe that by taking the savings that are to be accrued from identifying in this inventory of inventories and eliminating this duplication, this bill will more than pay for itself. There is a concept in the geospatial community that is map it once, use it many times. That's exactly what we're getting at here by doing this inventory of inventories and eliminating the redundancy. The fact is the federal government does not know what it owns, where it owns it, what condition it's in, what its appraised or market value is, what its characteristics are, and whether it is still in the public interest for the government to own it, whether it should put surplus or disposed, or what its designation and use should be. This bill will help solve that. As was indicated, it was back in 2005 that Interior Secretary Gail Norton testified before the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee that the department uses over 100 different property management systems. We don't know what has changed in the last 14 years. We don't know what improvements have been implemented. We don't know if there still are over 100 different property management systems and if the department under any administration has eliminated this duplication. The taxpayer is going to be the biggest beneficiary of this bill. Once the multipurpose cadastre or inventory is complete, the government will become a better property manager, better asset manager, and a more responsible steward of its land holdings. It will result in more efficient land management, provide savings, and generate more revenue back to the Department of the Interior so that money can be used for higher priorities, whether it's deficit reduction or has been mentioned, the maintenance backlog in the parks. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Palatiello. And now we have Mr. Thompson for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and all the committee members of the House Natural Resources Committee for having this timely hearing on geothermal permitting. I'll make a few brief remarks and then make myself available for questions. By way of introduction, Ormat Technologies is the largest geothermal developer in the United States. We are headquartered in Reno, Nevada, and recently acquired a company called U.S. Geothermal, which operates 2 geothermal power plants that serve the great state of Idaho. Our chairman often said that the secret to an overnight success is 50 years of hard work. Founded in 1956, ORMAT has designed and manufactured the equipment and developed geothermal resources representing 3 gigawatts of generation around the world. We own and operate 917 megawatts, or just under a gigawatt, have 1,300 employees who all work hard to avoid 4.5 million tons of CO2 per year. We operate facilities in 6 countries: the U.S., Kenya, Guatemala, Indonesia, Honduras, and the French Caribbean country of Guadeloupe. But probably most importantly, in the United States, we operate 576 megawatts of geothermal facilities and have 251,431 acres of BLM land under lease for future development and in operation for geothermal. Those leases are in the states of California, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. In 2018, ORMAT paid $2.6 million in royalties and close to $1 million in rentals to the Bureau of Land Management. We are working tirelessly to define and develop these geothermal resources throughout the West. I also have the honor today of representing the Geothermal Resource Council as their chairman of the Policy Committee. The Geothermal Resource Council is a nonprofit professional organization representing more than 1,300 members of all aspects of the geothermal industry in the United States. The GRC works tirelessly to advance our industry by supporting the development of geothermal energy resources through the communication of robust research, knowledge, and guidance. Both ORMAT and the GRC want to applaud Representative Folker for introducing H.R. 4026, the Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Lands Act. This act will streamline the federal permitting and leasing process, unleashing the nation's geothermal potential. When it comes to exploration and resource confirmation drilling, I want to point out that I'm not a geologist, reservoir engineer, or roughneck. But what I can tell you is that ORMAT and the Geothermal Resource Policy Council and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory have all identified that strengthening the administrative categorical exclusion for exploration and geothermal resource confirmation and streamlining adjoining leases will enable the geothermal industry to deploy more megawatts on public lands, creating new jobs, royalty revenues for local states and counties. In the recent DOE GeoVision report that was just issued, NREL undertook an analysis of non-technical barriers to geothermal deployment. This report highlighted that reducing project development timelines from 8 years to 4 years could increase resource discovery and more than double the geothermal deployment over the business-as-usual case by 2050. This would result in an additional 6.5 gigawatts of geothermal deployment. So what does that mean? Every 30 megawatt geothermal power plant that we build has a one-time expenditure for drilling and construction of about $135 million. If I did my math correct, and we multiply that by 216 to get us to 6,500 megawatts that could be deployed with this bill, that would represent a $29 billion investment. A 30 megawatt project we typically build has a reoccurring expenditure for operations, taxes, and royalties of $2 million. This bill would enable $432 million to go back to the federal government and the Bureau of Land Management if we could develop those 6,500 megawatts. In terms of jobs, a 30 megawatt geothermal project requires about 100 construction jobs. So under this bill, that would increase to 21,000 jobs. It requires about 300 construction jobs, so 64,000 jobs. And the operation of these for a 30 megawatt facility requires about 20 employees, so this bill would increase that to 5,184. I think most importantly, and in my closing comments, I'll say that a 30 megawatt geothermal development has a direct environmental impact to the local community. It avoids about 140,000 metric tons of CO2 annually. If we can develop 6,500 megawatts of geothermal, we would avoid 30 million tons of CO2 annually. With that, I'll make myself available for any questions. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'd like to thank all the panel for your testimony. I want to remind the members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask, and with that, I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. First question is to Mr. Ort. Can you give us an example of where the availability of a geologic and a geospatial where the availability of geologic and geospatial data preservation significantly influenced the outcome of a major project undertaken by a state geological survey?
Yes, certainly. The examples that we were provided in the testimony are there. I can tell you that the Geological Survey, again, of Michigan, now, again, this is enabling private sector to develop jobs and develop economic benefits. Of that $65 billion asset of potash is currently going on right now. Again, right now in Florida digitized all of their geologic wells, so they now have changed their complete knowledge of the aquifer system in Florida so that they can advise the counties where is best to draw water from for the water supply system. Additionally, they also found out where the natural contaminants are in that water, which is something we rarely talk about, but not all water is the water you want to drink. So with the knowledge of natural contamination as well as man-made contamination, they're able to provide a service to the community of providing that safe drinking water, of providing enough of that water for years to come.
Thank you. Ms. Book, with climate change forecasted to worsen the destruction that's caused by natural hazards like landslides and floods, the question is, how important is for USGS and their partners to expand the geologic mapping capabilities and knowledge?
Well, I mean, if you look at the range of hazards that we were talking about today, and what I provided in my testimony was related to if we're limiting to looking at one thing in one area, right? In isolation.
You speak into the microphone?
Sorry, I'll get a little closer. Is that better?
That's fine.
I feel too close now, but.
No, you're fine.
When you look at the testimony I provided, I talk about the need to really kind of actually overlap a little bit more areas where hazards occur, for the very reason that, like, if you look at studying sinkholes in isolation, you aren't going to get to see the full range of what's actually happening in a region. And so I think with respect to the USGS program in particular, they need some more funding so that they can actually expand more of the assessment work that they're doing for the whole range of things. Because you look at a place like Des Moines, Iowa, is where I'm from. Des Moines frequently is thought of as an agricultural place, et cetera. More and more, flooding continues to be a problem in the heartland of America along the big Mississippi River channel, et cetera. And so you need flood mapping. You're going to need other things too. They will have flooding and drought simultaneously, and people don't really think about the Midwest for things like that. So I think it's really important that we go further in how we're mapping.
Thank you. Mr. Palatiello, the technologies that we use today are really the result of decades of research, of testing, development of both the government, the private sector, and universities. Is the 3DEP program that you've spoken about and in your testimony something we might look back on in 30 years from now and point to as having been critical for the modern economy that we're in now?
Oh, absolutely. It is surprising that as economically advanced as our nation is, how poorly mapped we are, particularly when you compare that to other countries around the world. USGS did an assessment before it launched the 3DEP program. It did a national enhanced elevation assessment, and it identified about 300 key applications for the data. There are now thousands of applications that people have come back to USGS and reported and said, we've done this, we did R&D on that, we tested the data to solve this problem, things that no one even imagined just a few years ago when this program was launched. So that's a longer answer. My short answer to your question is an unequivocal yes.
Unequivocal. that was good.
Unequivocal.
Thank you. I'm going to now yield back and recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ort, I had to say for my dad, because my dad's a geologist for over 50 years, and every time he comes to Arizona, he goes up to the USGS. So he's mesmerized by that. So, Mr. Pelletier, I couldn't say it better. You said map once, how about drill once, and use multiple applications. The same thing, my dad was in oil and gas. Then, you know, people don't realize that as you go deeper, it gets hotter. And it's a waste of what we do with that. So this is a wonderful opportunity. I'm one of the original authors of the small hydro power plants that are in canal systems, like in Arizona on the big CAP. So there's no reasons why we can't see the small operational steam engine in regards to reclaiming some of the energy, particularly off of the drill sites or rig sites. So thank you very much for that. Also in that 3D application, particularly in the LiDAR application, that has a profound application to forestry. Nature Conservancy has used the tablet application so that we can have smart cutting in regards to forest thinning, utilizing the LiDAR portfolio. So you hit it very, very well. Mr. Thompson, I want to go through this with you. I mean, I'm originally from Pinedale, Wyoming, on the edge of the Yellowstone caldera, so I'm very aware of the geothermal potential that's all the way through that area. Can you give me a little bit more explanation about how the categorical exclusion would help formulate an easier pathway?
Sure. To the ranking member, thank you. So geothermal has to do considerable drilling to define the geothermal resource. Unlike other renewable technologies where you can know where the resource is by putting out an anemometer to measure the wind or the solar radiance, we have to drill wells to try to find that geothermal resource. And today we have a categorical exclusion for exploration. BLM has interpreted that to mean that we cannot interact with the reservoir. So we can drill a well to find temperature and geology. What this looks to do is add the word test, which would allow us to try to test that geothermal reservoir. So still using the same terms of the existing categorical exclusion, the 5-acre disturbance, we're looking for parity with the oil and gas industry to say, can we drill very small wells that can be easily reclaimed to define this geothermal resource without having to go through a full environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. Now, there are many steps to geothermal development. We drill an exploration well to find temperature and gradient. We will then drill a resource confirmation well to try to do a flow test to measure the chemistry, to look at permeability and flow rate. Then, if we know that there's a geothermal resource, developers can go get financing, begin the NEPA process with the EA or EIS, and then look to develop larger diameter wells and eventually build a geothermal project. The situation today, there are times where we have to go through the EA process 3 or 4 times on federal lands before we can bring a geothermal project to development.
So under this legislation, this would allow co-production with already existing wells. Can you give us a little bit of background with that?
So ORMAT actually developed a project in Wyoming at the Rocky Mountain Oil Test Center where there was a water break in an oil and gas well. We were able to take that hot water and run it through our ORMAT energy converter or binary process and produce additional electricity from this water break. This provision looks to expedite that process. So if there are applications in existing oil and gas applications where we can develop geothermal resources, we can do so very quickly.
Why would you just limit it to oil and gas? Why not mining? In my state, we have Resolution Copper that's mining at 7,000 feet, and people don't realize that they actually have to pipe supercooled air to actually be able to mine in that area. How can that also apply to mining?
I think it absolutely could. I think what this bill is looking to do is under the provisions of the existing Geothermal Steam Act and the provisions of the oil and gas, we are looking for parity, which already had these exemptions and exclusions for doing this kind of resource confirmation or exploratory drilling. If we were to find a We have very large mine sites in the state of Nevada as well, operated by Barrick and Newmont, and they have the same issue with hot water. They typically will have already gone through a comprehensive environmental impact statement for that mine, and if they have the hot water that we can produce geothermal from, I don't think there's a barrier to doing that today, other than the economics and how much power they need at that mine site.
Multiple sourcing out of the same application. Real quickly, Mr. Pelletier, I like the application that your comments in regards to the inventory. I'm one of the people that looked at SNFLMA, in which Harry Reid landlocked the state of Nevada. You have to know what you have in order to follow the law, which requires the federal government to inventory land and find out if it's for disposal. And if it's for disposal, get it out to the public. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, if I may just comment in response to Mr. Gosar. I want to make it clear, I don't, this has been a great kumbaya today, and there's great bipartisan support for these things, including the FLARE Act. The FLARE Act is agnostic on the issue of disposal or government ownership or multiple use. It's about good data and good decision-making. We will leave it to you to debate what to do with a piece of land. What we're here to say today is let's make those decisions based on good data.
Chair now recognizes Representative Westerman for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Palatiello, for talking about the FLARE Act again. I wanted to talk about that a little bit more. The GAO has listed federal real property management as being at high risk of waste, fraud, and abuse since 2003. In fact, in this March 2019 report, they again emphasize that the federal government does not have a handle on the things it owns. To quote the report, the federal government would save millions of dollars by disposing of unneeded buildings and reducing lease cost. In your written testimony, you note that the CBO score wasn't accurate for H.R. 2485. How, given the GAO report, will this bill save taxpayer money, and not just the GAO report, but in other areas? Can you explain, and you mentioned in your testimony that it would save money, but could you go into a little more detail on that? And Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit this GAO report for the record.
Without objection.
First of all, Mr. Westerman, the National Academy did a study almost a decade ago now on creating a national parcel system. Every parcel of land in the country, whether it's in government ownership or private ownership. The need for that became abundantly clear when we had the mortgage crisis in 2008. We did not have a real-time early warning system to know that there was an increase in foreclosures in a certain area in the country. When the Academy did their report, they had a cost estimate of what it would cost to have an inventory of every parcel in the country. The CBO cost estimate on the FLARE Act is higher than what the Academy estimated to do every parcel of land in the country, and the FLARE Act is only talking about federal land. So right there, I think the CBO estimate is greatly exaggerated. Secondly, I don't think CBO truly took into account what the current status is of the proliferation of antiquated inventories, and your bill has that inventory of inventories and instructs the Secretary to then eliminate those that are no longer needed if you have one current, accurate, interoperable computer database inventory. So your bill has a provision that actually triggers savings by avoiding and eliminating that duplication. So I think there are savings there, and as I said in my statement, I think those savings alone are greater than any cost that may result from implementing the bill.
And you talked about Secretary Norton's testimony from 14 years ago about how there's over 100 property management programs. And we focus a lot in this committee, obviously, on DOI and the National Park Service. But when we talk about other agencies like the Corps of Engineers, DOD, or DHS, is there a central system that's utilized for tracking the condition of buildings and tracking the assets in those agencies?
On buildings, yes, that is now in development by GSA. Congress passed legislation to improve that process. You set up a commission to oversee that. Former Chairman Ray Hall is on that commission, but they're looking at buildings. They're not looking at land. A lot of what drove that was an executive order that President Bush issued, I believe, in 2003. It exempted the public land. It was an executive order on real property asset management, and it set up a interagency committee and a structure to try to tackle this issue. That executive order had number one, exempted public lands and really focused on buildings. But Section 7 of that executive order said that the Secretary of Agriculture for the Forest Service and the Secretary of the Interior should come together and make recommendations with regard to an inventory of the public lands. To the best of my knowledge, those two departments have never met on that issue and never implemented that section of President Bush's executive order. That's why we believe your legislation is necessary.
And since you mentioned federal lands, I mean, it's just mind-boggling to think the federal government owns over 640 million acres nationwide, with thousands of buildings and bridges and more developments on that land. We're out of time, but there just really isn't any rationale why a large landholder like that, with today's technology, that we don't have a much better system to manage and track that, and that's really what we're proposing in this bill. So
I would agree.
I go back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Fulcher for 5 minutes of question.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And this is in regard to Resolution 4026, the Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Lands Act. But first, Mr. Thompson, I want to just say thank you to you and your company for the investment in our state, in Idaho. I think there's about at least 40 employees there at this point, and so we appreciate your investment. My question is directed to you, and I'd just like to get your insight as to the challenge that are there currently. What are you facing right now when you try to move forward with the geothermal project?
So as your bill, I think, targets, I think the biggest issue for us today is permitting quickly to develop and define the geothermal resource subsurface, under the ground. And the quicker that we can do that, the more cost effectively we can build these power plants. That in turn allows us to offer a lower per kilowatt hour price and build more projects. And so if we take out a lease and permit it, and it takes 4 or 5 years to permit that project, that affects our return on investment and the price that we can charge for it. So by streamlining this permitting, you have targeted the single biggest factor in, I think, the delay in geothermal development in the western United States.
So this bill really has a couple of key components. The first one has to do with the categorical exclusion for the exploratory site, and also the permission for a non-competitive lease on adjacent land to an existing project. If that were to pass, give me some kind of estimate, give me some kind of feedback on how that would impact your current process and how that might spur potential projects.
The short answer is it would probably double the installed geothermal capacity in the country that we have today. The United States has a little over 3,000 megawatts of installed geothermal. That is the equivalent of about 9,000 megawatts of solar, because geothermal produces power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. So the amount of kilowatt hours we produce is staggeringly bigger than intermittent resources. And by doubling the installed capacity in this country of its renewable resources, you reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, you reduce emissions substantially. I think in my opening comments I said you would reduce our emissions by 30 million metric tons if we could be producing 6.7 gigawatts of additional geothermal in this country.
Mr. Thompson, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Poltro. I now recognize Mr. Hearn for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gosar. It's refreshing actually to be in a hearing today where we're talking about real solutions and not debating the Green New Deal and all the things around that. I appreciate Mr. Thompson and your all the above approach and your portion of that and being able to quantify your savings. I specifically want to talk about our conversation and managing our assets in this country. As a business owner for 34 years, I was shocked when we were actually talking about this in this hearing. As my colleague, Mr. Westerman, said, you know, it's just unimaginable that a country this technologically advanced for so many years, actually, and we debate the management and the sale and the use of federal lands, we don't even know what we own. I would imagine that if the federal or the people of the United States knew that, which they will now, they would be shocked that we're taking taxpayer money, debating and arguing and having hearings day after day, meeting after meeting about managing federal lands, and we don't even know what we own. Only in Washington, D.C., in the bureaucracy here, could we have that happen. No business would survive if it didn't know its assets. I would surmise that any states wouldn't because they dispose of their state lands and buildings on a regular basis to keep something they can manage, but not in the federal government, not where you can just print money and not be accountable to really anyone. So it's refreshing to see us discussing this. It's refreshing to have folks that are representing, you know, both parties that agree that we need to manage this. For me, for the life of me, I can't understand why we haven't done this so far. And you know, I'm thankful that this was introduced by my Democrat colleague and that Mr. Westerman is a co-sponsor on this. Dear friend of mine from Arkansas, not Alaska as the document says. But that, you know, Mr. Palatiello, could you talk to us about why this is a great investment to bring all these inventories together? I mean, just for the record, I know we've talked sort of around this and we've talked about the problem, but why is this so important for the American people, and how can this save taxpayer dollars, and what does this mean for America?
That's a great question, and I'll try to be brief in my answer because I could talk all day in response to your question. In the time that we have been involved in this issue, we've come up with instance after instance where the inefficiency in the current system manifests itself, and sometimes in extraordinarily glaring fashion. I remember one instance that came to our attention, and that was when the Forest Service on a national forest in Missouri had declared a piece of property surplus and had put it out for disposal and sale until a private property owner came forward and said, no, you don't own that, I do, and he presented the deed. It was because of the inadequacy of the land records of the Forest Service. I mentioned in my testimony different activities that go on in the public lands, the revenue being generated to the government as a result of those activities, whether it's royalties or leases or franchise fees. The Inspector General, the GAO have all come back and said we're shortchanging ourselves because our data is so poor that we're not generating that revenue that we should. And this committee does not need to be reminded that the Interior Department is second only to the IRS in terms of the amount of revenue it generates for the federal government. So the economy, the efficiency, the cost savings, the elimination of duplication, the better land records. This committee knows better than anyone else when any of you want to introduce a bill that affects the public lands and you send a request down to the Interior Department, and I've heard this from professional staff for years, how long does it take for you to get like a legal description of a piece of land back to put into your legislation? It takes months. Why? The inadequacy of their land records. It takes them so long to do that research that holds things up. Let me make one final point, if I may, sir. This committee did a bill after Katrina, a piece of legislation to identify federal land that was available for temporary housing for the victims of Katrina. That shouldn't take an act of Congress. That should take about 10 minutes of keystrokes at a computer to give you that answer.
Let me ask you one final question with the remainder of my time here. Do we have any example in the federal government, in each of the departments? My colleague mentioned the Corps, DOD, DOE, do we have any of those particular departments that do a good job of keeping records of their assets, both land, building, and other assets that you are aware of? That answer must be no. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yeah, to the gentleman's query, in the lands package, we passed a bill called the Bureau of Reclamation's Transparency Act. And it requires the Bureau of Reclamation to come back with an inventory, status, and maintenance log for Congress to decide as a Article I power. So it's already starting, and this is a perfect segue back into it. Absolutely. We have the public charge of managing those and knowing that inventory on behalf of the American people.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate us having this debate. It's not really even a debate. It's an agreement with all of us that we need to do this. I think it would be a great example. It's the very problem we have with DOD and many of our other departments. They know not what they have, and yet they want more of what they know not they have. So, thank you.
Thank you, and I pretty much have, this is kind of the end of our formal process of the but one of the things that I picked up, yes, Democrats can pick up a few things from Republicans, from the ranking member was, at the close of each hearing, if we have the time, we'd like to ask the members of the panel, what is the one thing, just a minute or so just to answer, what is the one thing you wished we had asked, or the one thing you really wanted to say to us, or you really want now to say to us, that you now have an opportunity? That's it. If you want to respond, respond. But really, what did we not ask you that you really want to tell us? Jump in, Mr. Thompson.
Through the chairman, thinking about this categorical exclusion and often the question we get about environmental impact, I neglected to point out that the geothermal footprint, when we develop a geothermal power plant, the footprint is very small. It usually takes about 15 acres. We recently built a project that was 150 megawatts in rural Nevada, took up a total surface disturbance of 144 acres. If that project had been a solar project, it would have taken up 3,200 acres to produce the same amount of power. And so the geothermal footprint is 22 times smaller than that of solar PV. And so when we look at, bills to streamline this permitting, I just want you all to keep in mind the very nascent footprint of this incredibly prolific power source that's in the western United States. Produces power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and many of our rural county commissioners and many of the counties that we operate in really think of us as an ATM, because these projects, once developed, provide incredible royalties and impact to the local community, but don't require additional fire stations and police, because as you heard, the power plants have about 20 employees at each facility. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Palaciello, is there anything you want to tell us?
Number one, thank you for having us. Thank you for holding this hearing. I appreciate your attention. Mr. Hearn, I know that you have a fine mapping firm that you just visited right after Labor Day, and you've got a real asset in your district, and we want to continue our discussion with you on some of those matters. And just thank you for the opportunity to testify, and hope that we can move these bills promptly. The FLARE Act has passed this committee, I think, on 3 previous occasions. It has been in a comprehensive energy bill that passed the Senate, but unfortunately did not pass the House. So we're hopeful that we can get the ball over the goal line in this Congress. So thank you again.
Thank you. Ms. Book, anything you want to say?
So you spent a bit of time talking about inventory, public assets and things. Other public assets are energy that we're producing, like what Paul was talking about, and thinking about other natural resources, and then overlaying where hazards happen. So what we're really talking about, what I think Mr. Orton and I were talking about in expanding the sinkhole bill, is really to talk about a broader inventory, if you will, of the different kinds of hazards across the U.S. as we're assessing where they're at, okay? But then also, many years ago, the Department of Energy, and when I say many years ago, it was quite some time, like 15 years ago, and the Department of the Interior got together and talked about how they could actually overlay a lot of their data sets in the energy side with public lands so that we'd have a better idea of who's producing what where, and share resources so that the permitting process would be a little more streamlined, things like that. It never got off the ground because there wasn't funding for it. Okay, so as you consider inventories and assessments and things like that, keep in mind that if we don't back it up with some financial support, it's very hard to do that, and the data from the private sector only goes so far because they can't always share it. So thank you again for inviting the Institute to speak.
Thank you. Mr. Ort.
Good morning again. I think I would like to bring everybody back, and everybody here is all endorsed or enclosed in reality that geohazards don't, if a sinkhole happens in another state, it's not directly impacting Washington, D.C. It impacts that local community. And we need to realize that geohazards are community-based events. As a federal nation and a federal body here, yes, passing laws that tell us how sinkholes work and how they might change and all that are great, but we really need the community response at the state level, geologic mapping at that level to tell us not where they've happened, because once you've been through an earthquake, you've been through an earthquake. What you need to know is what the potential is, what is the risk of these events happening in other areas. So I think, knowing that information and providing that information at the right scale with all the different geohazards that could happen, possibly due to some climate change activities because of differences in drought conditions or differences in precipitation, that is something that we really need to focus on. Again, risk-based, not it's already happened. And one of the things, John's testimony, you do a lot of 3D mapping, and I've brought some tools that we use at the community level, at either the city, townships, or counties. Our people may not know exactly what maps are. Some people don't relay well with maps, especially contour lines and trying to do three-dimensional imaging. So we've started doing some three-dimensional printing. I welcome you to take a look at it. These tools I bring out to the township, and all of a sudden they realize, yes, we're in the middle of a landslide, or yes, we've got sinkholes all around us. Yes, there's sinkholes generated because of unlined drainage ditches on highways. So, we need to be able to map at that scale,
Right.
not at a national level scale. Thank you for your time, sir.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank all the panelists for this wonderful interactive session. I want to thank the members of the panel. Before I go, I want to also thank the Department of the Interior for sending a response to Representative Fulcher about his bill. But I would like to remind the department that you never sent that to the committee, so we don't have, what we had asked for was kind of to have them respond to the bills. So again, in the future, I'm just saying, we really want to have a closer relationship with Interior, just as we've talked about here, and to hope that we get their opinion on all the bills that we submit. With that, I think there's been a great hearing. I want to remind the members that they may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We're going to ask the witnesses to respond to those questions in writing. Members must submit their questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and witnesses will be held open. The record will be held open for 10 additional days for witnesses to respond to those questions. There's no further business. This subcommittee is adjourned.